Hello, this is Know Your Nodes, a video series where I explore the basic building blocks of Audulus 3, the node library. My name is Robert Syrett, and today I'd like to talk about clocks and how to use them to synchronize events in your patches. What is a clock when it comes to modular synthesis? It's a module that creates a stream of gates to synchronize events throughout a patch. Some of these events might be a sequencer advancing a step, random event triggers, switches changing their routing, and more. The clock in Audulus isn't technically a node, but there is a clock somewhere in almost every modular synth patch ever. So understanding how a clock works is like understanding the heartbeat of your creation. I'd like to start by taking a peek inside of the clock module that we have in Audulus so we can see what makes it tick, as well as an overview of some of the modules that we have to help route and create events with that clock signal. I'd also like to go over some ways that you can use external clocks with your Audulus patches, and then finally I'd like to bring up an example patch where I put all these ideas into use. We find the clock in the library under Utility, Clock, and Clock. There are many types of clock in the Audulus library, but once we know how to use this one, the others will be easy to use. The clock in Audulus outputs positive only or unipolar gate signals. There's a rate control with a clock graphic. The range of frequencies is between 0 and 20 Hz. 20 Hz might seem like it's fast, but typically you'll be dividing down when you are using clock, so a fast rate is sometimes desired. There's a duty cycle control, which determines how much of each cycle the gate is high. And then there's an on-off switch. There are also two gate inputs. One is the top, which resets the clock cycle, synchronizing it with external sources, and one running into the on-off switch, which acts as a mute and unmute. Looking inside, we can see that the clock is actually a phasor oscillator. The gates are actually pulse wave, and the duty cycle is really the width of the pulse. The rate knob has some quadratic scaling on it, so that there is fine control over the lower frequencies. The on-off switch is created with a multiply node, silencing the output when either of the inputs is 0. It's important to note that the on-off switch sends a single frame pulse to the sync input of the phasor. That way, whenever you switch the clock on, it will start at the beginning of the duty cycle. You can also see from the diagram that the gate input for run does not reset the wave, so you would want to patch this externally. Because the master clock of a patch is typically routed to many different destinations, usually the first thing I will attach it to is a via. That way, in the future, if I choose to replace that clock with an external clock source or another clock, I can do so without having to reroute all the important connections. Instead, I can just plug it right into the via. You can make a via by using an expression with a single character such as X, or you can find one in the module library under Building. Essentially, all the modules that you will find under the Gate and Clock Utilities sections are things that are useful for this type of patching. But today I'd like to focus on just a few tools that I return to time and time again. Let's start with the clock divider, which I think of as a gate counter. It lets one of every X number of gate signals pass through. I have given mine an incrementing counter, so I know when the next clock pulse is about to hit. The flip-flop also divides the frequency, but does it in a slightly different way than the clock divider. The flip-flop is just a counter that goes back and forth between 0 and 1 with each incoming clock pulse. So it creates a halved frequency with exactly a 50% duty cycle. This is great for turning on and off modulation signals, or just subdividing the frequency from 16th notes to 8th notes to quarter notes to whole notes to bars, etc. So far, you may be thinking that all this strict branching down from a master frequency is going to make everything too rigid and too consistent, but there's a tool for that as well. The chance gate pass-through does what the name suggests and provides a probability of a gate passing through. What this amounts to is that if you have a patch and something is happening too consistently or too repetitively, then I would put this in that signal path and it can break it up a bit. Or you can have it on a high frequency thing like hi-hats and have it sound really erratic and quasi-random, or actually, I guess, random. And finally for today, the gate smear. The gate smear is a utility that allows you to change the duty cycle of your clock after the fact. As I mentioned, the clock divider doesn't have the same duty cycle because it's just letting one of every so often gates pass through. So if you wanted to make that longer, the gate smear is a great way to go about it. As I mentioned before, at some point you may wish to synchronize your Audulus patch with an external source. So now we're going to take a look at some ways that you can do that using Midi, CV, and even a drum track. Unfortunately, as of Audulus version 3.5.2, there is no direct access to the Midi clock signal. So in order to use Midi as a clock, I found the most reliable way is to dedicate a channel of the Midi device playing a note on every 16th note, making sure that each note isn't too long and overlapping so that each gate is nice and distinct. Then I can simply use the gate out of the Midi keyboard node for the appropriate Midi channel. Obviously, some Midi devices only have one channel, and if you don't feel like playing a note on every 16th, this can be kind of a hassle. But if you still have a CV clock or hard panning, you can use those. For example, a Korg Volca or a modular will provide you with a clock or square wave LFO that you can send to your audio interface and have it run the Audulus patch. However, if you have a typical audio interface, you will find that incoming signals go through a high-pass filter and that the signal is distorted. So making some sort of Schmitt trigger to reconstruct the signal is required. I find that offsetting the signal so that the rising edge of the square crosses the 0 line, and then creating a comparison expression will usually get me the pulse wave I need. If not, I can always use a little gate smear to make the duty cycle perfect. Finally, in some situations, the best option available is to use the hard panning on a drum machine. Admittedly, you only get one channel of audio using this method, but sometimes that's all you need. The first step is to find the most click-like percussion, such as a kick, and make it more clicky by reducing the decay. Then, like using a Midi track, you set a pulse on each 16th note. Finally, once you get your click track into Audulus, you can use an envelope follower, as well as a comparator, and a gate smear to make that same, now familiar, perfect clock signal. Okay, now let's put these ideas into practice. Okay, so for this portion of the video, I'm going to go with unscripted. I'm going to try and keep it brief, but I may ramble. Please bear with me. The patch that I have here, it comes down to a clock, and then it's going to several different parts, which are being fed into a mixer with some effects on it, and then out in my audio interface. The clock that I'm using is actually coming from my drum machine. Let me start that. You can see that there's a click track that's coming in, and it goes through this envelope follower, at which point they're going to look like this. And then they go into this comparator. And from there, the signal gets subdivided, and that subdivided frequency goes to this trigger sequencer. And that trigger sequencer goes into this step sequencer, which goes into a quantizer and a simple sine wave. This is a mute button I have set up for this track. Oh yeah, there's a delay on this track only. It's an insert effect. Next up, there's this one, which is going to this sequencer right here, which is the revamped Citrus sequencer. And it's going into this karplus-strong. And let's take a listen to that. Now, the clock pulse is coming up here. It's being divided into 16. So every 16 beats, it changes the value here, which changes the sequence on the knobs. I can change the sequence of these sequences by turning the knobs. Change the rhythm. And maybe change the sound of the karplus-strong algorithm. Yeah, change the timbre and all that. And then above that is the Pang. Pang has an old school Citrus sequencer. Actually, it was using the Citrus sequencer in this patch that made me think I should go back and revisit it and change some things. But basically, this one, the step rate is coming from a crossfader, which is being turned on and off by this flip-flop, which sometimes gets turned on and off every 8th bar. So it's a variable rate. Actually, listening to it now, I think it could go even faster. And then finally, I have the sound that's coming in from the Digitact itself. Let me turn on some of the tracks. There's the kick, some of the drums, incidental percussion. I'm going to bring in the other parts. Oh, and one other thing. There's a stutter effect that you might hear. It's being turned on and off through this series of flip-flops and this % pass-through. And its modulation sometimes is coming from this keg here, an excellent new envelope/LFO type device. Yeah, and basically once the system is set up, I can go through and I can change patterns here by muting. And changing patterns on the Digitact. And muting and unmuting notes here. And then I can cut the clock and it will kill the patch. And you're just left with the drum machine. Alright, well that completes my overview of the patch. This was the patch that I used to make the music for the rest of the video. I hope that you found this video helpful. If you have a comment, please leave it below. It always brightens my day. If you have a loud car that can drive by at the worst possible moment, yeah, I guess you should do that too. Oh, and you can subscribe. Subscribing, that also is pretty cool. And one more thing. Visit the Audulus forum. There's a link in the description. You can use all the patches that you see in this video. All right, thanks a bunch. Bye.